In the glittering heart of Manhattan, where skyscrapers cast long shadows over dreams of ambition and betrayal, the fashion world buzzed with anticipation for the annual gala of Velluto, a luxury brand synonymous with elegance and power. At its helm was Julian Voss, a 38-year-old CEO whose charisma and ruthlessness had transformed Velluto from a boutique label into a global empire. His face, chiseled and perpetually shadowed with a 5 o'clock stubble, graced the covers of Vogue and Forbes alike, his piercing blue eyes promising both seduction and danger. Julian was a man who thrived on control, whether it was over his boardroom or his meticulously curated personal life. But beneath the polished surface of his success lay a web of secrets that threatened to unravel everything he had built. Julian's wife, Elise Voss, was the epitome of grace, a former model whose ethereal beauty had once captivated runways before she traded the spotlight for a quieter role as his partner. At 34, pregnant with their first child, Elise carried herself with a serene dignity that masked the growing unease in her heart. Their marriage, once a fairy tale splashed across tabloids, had begun to fray under the weight of Julian's relentless ambition and late-night absences. Elise had always known the fashion world was cutthroat, but she hadn't anticipated how deeply its claws would sink into her own life. She stood in their penthouse, a sprawling glass-walled haven overlooking Central Park, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly as she gazed at the city's twinkling lights. The air was heavy with the scent of her jasmine perfume, a fragrance Julian had once said reminded him of their honeymoon in Santorini. Now, it felt like a fading memory. The gala was days away, and Velluto's latest collection, a daring fusion of avant-garde silhouettes and sustainable fabrics, was poised to redefine the industry. Julian had been obsessive about every detail, from the hand-stitched embroidery to the guest list that read like a who's who of fashion royalty. But what consumed him most was the centerpiece, a gown designed for his mistress, Cassandra Lee, a 26-year-old rising star in the modeling world whose sultry allure and strategic charm had caught his eye at a casting call. Cassandra was everything Elise was not: bold, unapologetically ambitious, and unafraid to wield her beauty like a weapon. Her presence in Julian's life was an open secret among Velluto's inner circle, whispered in boardrooms and dressing rooms, but never spoken aloud to Elise. That morning, Julian had returned home at dawn, his suit rumpled and his eyes bloodshot from a night he claimed was spent finalizing the gala's logistics. Elise, awake and restless, had watched him slip into their bedroom, his phone buzzing incessantly with messages he silenced without a glance. She didn't ask where he'd been, she hadn't for months. Instead, she busied herself with the nursery, folding tiny onesies and arranging books on a shelf, trying to anchor herself in the promise of their future child. But Julian's voice, sharp and impatient, cut through her thoughts. "Elise, I need you to do something for me," he said, standing in the doorway, his tie loosened like a man who'd already won a war he wasn't fighting. "Cassandra's gown for the gala, it's wrinkled. The atelier is swamped, and I need it perfect. Can you iron it?" The request landed like a slap, though his tone was casual, almost indifferent. Elise's fingers tightened around the soft cotton in her hands, her heart pounding as the implication sank in. Cassandra's gown. The dress that would steal the spotlight, worn by the woman who was stealing her husband. She wanted to refuse, to scream, to hurl the onesie at him and demand why he thought she'd degrade herself for his mistress. But the weight of her pregnancy, the exhaustion of carrying their child, and the unspoken fear of losing what little remained of their marriage kept her silent. She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line, and followed him to the study where the gown lay draped over a chair like a taunting specter. The dress was a masterpiece, emerald silk that shimmered like liquid, its plunging neckline and fitted bodice designed to accentuate Cassandra's lithe frame. Elise ran her fingers over the fabric, her breath catching at its beauty and the cruelty it represented. She set up the ironing board, her movements mechanical, each press of the iron smoothing out wrinkles while deepening the ones in her soul. The steam rose in soft clouds, mingling with the tears she refused to let fall. She imagined Cassandra wearing it, Turning heads, Julian's hand on her waist as he paraded her through the gala, while Elise, heavy with child, would be expected to smile and play the dutiful wife. The humiliation burned, but she pressed on, the iron hissing with every stroke, as if it, too, resented the task. Julian's mother, Vivian Voss, was the shadow that loomed over Veludo's empire. A formidable woman in her late 60s, Vivian had founded the brand in her youth, building it from a single sewing machine in a Brooklyn loft to a name that rivaled Chanel and Dior. Her silver hair was always swept into a chignon, her tailored suits as sharp as her tongue. Vivian had never fully warmed to Elise, viewing her as too soft for the cutthroat world of fashion, but she tolerated her as the mother of her future grandchild. Vivian's relationship with Julian was complex, equal parts pride and frustration. She had groomed him to take over Veludo, but his reckless personal choices tested her patience. When she learned of Cassandra, through whispers from loyal staff, her disapproval was palpable, though she kept her counsel, biding her time. Vivian's office at Veludo's headquarters was a shrine to her legacy, walls lined with framed sketches of her early designs and photos of her with industry legends. She sat behind her mahogany desk, her fingers drumming as she reviewed the gala's final preparations. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and her assistant, Clara, entered, her face pale. "Mrs. Voss, you need to see this," Clara said, sliding a tablet across the desk. It was a grainy photo, taken at a rooftop bar, of Julian and Cassandra, their heads bent close, his hand on her thigh. The gossip blogs were already buzzing, speculating about the mystery woman, and what it meant for Elise. Vivian's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a tight smile that promised retribution. She had built Veludo on integrity and vision, and she would not let her son's indiscretions tarnish it. Elise, unaware of the photo, finished ironing the gown and hung it carefully in a garment bag, her hands trembling as she zipped it shut. She felt like a ghost in her own home, invisible yet indispensable, her love for Julian a chain she couldn't break. She thought of their early days, when he'd sketch designs on napkins and promise her the world. Now, the world he'd built excluded her, relegating her to tasks that mocked her devotion. She sank onto the couch, her hand cradling her belly, whispering to her unborn child, "We'll be okay," though she wasn't sure she believed it. Meanwhile, Vivian summoned Julian to her office, her voice icy over the phone. When he arrived, cocky and dismissive, she didn't bother with pleasantries. "You're a fool," she said, tossing the tablet onto the desk. Julian glanced at the photo, his jaw tightening, but he offered no defense. "This ends now," Vivian continued, her voice low and dangerous. "You will not destroy this company or Elise with your selfishness." Julian shrugged, his arrogance unshaken. "It's just business, mother. Cassandra's the face of the campaign. Elise understands." Vivian's laugh was sharp, devoid of humor. "Elise is carrying your child, and you have her ironing your mistress's dress. You're not just a fool, you're a liability." Vivian's mind was already working, calculating the damage and the remedy. She had always protected Veludo, even when it meant making ruthless decisions, firing loyal designers who'd lost their edge, suing competitors who dared to copy her work. Now, her son was the threat, and Cassandra was the catalyst. Vivian knew the gala would be the battleground, where loyalties would be tested and secrets exposed. She called Clara back, instructing her to dig deeper into Cassandra's background, contracts, communications, anything that could be leveraged. Vivian wasn't just protecting Elise, she was safeguarding the empire she'd bled for. Back at the penthouse, Elise stood by the window, the garment bag a silent accusation in the corner. She didn't know Vivian was plotting, or that the gala would ignite a firestorm that would consume both Julian's affair and his empire. All she knew was the weight of her love, her pain, and the child growing inside her, a child who deserved better than a father who valued ambition over family. As the city lights blurred through her tears, Elise made a quiet vow: she would not let her child inherit a legacy of betrayal. The gala was coming, and with it, a reckoning none of them could escape. The air in the penthouse was thick with tension, the kind that clings to silk drapes and polished marble floors, amplifying every whispered word and stifled sob. Evelyn stood at the ironing board, her hands trembling as they gripped the iron, its steam hissing like a coiled snake. The dress, scarlet, bold, and obscenely expensive, lay before her, a taunt in fabric form. It belonged to her, the mistress, the woman who had slithered into Evelyn's life and claimed her husband, Marcus, the CEO of Voluto, a fashion empire that dressed the elite in threads of power and seduction. Evelyn's swollen belly pressed against the edge of the board, a reminder of the life she carried, a life Marcus had barely acknowledged since his affair began. The request, no, the demand, that she iron this dress for his lover was a new low, a deliberate twist of the knife in her heart. Yet, she complied, her hands moving mechanically, smoothing out wrinkles as tears blurred her vision. The penthouse, once a sanctuary of love, now felt like a gilded cage. Its floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city's glittering skyline, but to Evelyn, it was a mocking backdrop to her unraveling world. Marcus had built Voluto from nothing, his charisma and vision transforming it into a name synonymous with luxury. Evelyn had been his muse, his partner, her designs gracing the runways in Paris and Milan. But now, her sketches gathered dust, and her role had been reduced to this, ironing a dress for the woman who had stolen her place. The mistress, Isabella, was a former model, all sharp cheekbones and sharper ambition, who had caught Marcus's eye at a gala 6 months ago. Since then, Evelyn's life had become a series of humiliations, each one cutting deeper than the last. She pressed the iron harder, the fabric yielding under the heat, and imagined it was Isabella's smug smile she was flattening. The dress was a Voluto original, one of Evelyn's own designs, which made the task even more unbearable. Every sequin, every curve of the hem, was a piece of her soul, now draped over the body of her rival. Marcus had strolled in that morning, his tailored suit impeccable, his tone casual as he tossed the dress onto the ironing board. Isabella needs it for tonight's event, he'd said, not meeting her eyes. Make sure it's perfect. No mention of the baby, no acknowledgement of the doctor's appointment Evelyn had scheduled that afternoon. Just the dress. Always the dress. Evelyn's hands stilled, the iron hovering above the scarlet fabric. She could ruin it. One slip, one careless press, and the dress would be scorched, unwearable. The thought was intoxicating, a flicker of rebellion in her suffocating compliance. But she didn't. Not yet. She set the iron down and stepped back, wiping her hands on her apron as if she could wipe away the shame. The penthouse was silent, save for the distant hum of the city below. Marcus was at the office, no doubt plotting the next Voluto collection with Isabella by his side, her laughter filling the boardroom where Evelyn once held court. The doorbell chimed, sharp and intrusive. Evelyn froze, her heart lurching. She wasn't expecting anyone. She smoothed her hair, adjusted her loose maternity dress, and opened the door to find her mother, Vivian, standing there. Vivian was a force of nature, a woman who had built her own empire in real estate, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, her eyes sharp as cut glass. She didn't wait for an invitation, sweeping past Evelyn into the penthouse, her designer heels clicking on the marble. Evelyn, darling, you look like death, Vivian said, her voice a mix of concern and exasperation. She set her handbag on the console table, her gaze landing on the ironing board. What's this? You're ironing now. For her. Evelyn's throat tightened. She hadn't told Vivian everything, but her mother had a knack for sniffing out weakness. It's just a dress, Evelyn murmured, avoiding her mother's eyes. Vivian's lips pursed, a storm brewing in her expression. Just a dress. Don't insult me, Evelyn. I raised you to be a lioness, not a maid. She stepped closer, her hand lifting Evelyn's chin, forcing their eyes to meet. You're carrying my grandchild, and you're ironing that harlot's clothes. Where is Marcus? At the office, Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. With her. Vivian's eyes narrowed, and Evelyn felt the weight of her mother's judgment, but also her fierce protectiveness. Vivian had never liked Marcus, had warned Evelyn from the start that his charm was a veneer, his ambition a blade that could cut both ways. But Evelyn had been in love, blind to the cracks in his facade. Now, those cracks were canyons, and she was falling through them. Vivian didn't speak for a moment, her gaze sweeping the penthouse as if cataloging every detail of Evelyn's diminished life. Then she turned to the ironing board, picked up the scarlet dress, and held it up to the light. "This is your design, isn't it?" she asked, her voice deceptively calm. Evelyn nodded, her chest aching. "From the spring collection." Vivian's smile was cold, dangerous. "Then let's make sure it's remembered." Before Evelyn could react, Vivian strode to the kitchen, the dress trailing behind her like a blood-red banner. She yanked open a drawer, pulled out a pair of shears, and began to cut. The sound of the blades slicing through the fabric was a violent symphony, each snip a release of the rage Evelyn had buried. Evelyn gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, but she didn't stop her mother. She couldn't. The dress fell in tatters to the floor, a scarlet ruin, and Vivian dropped the shears with a clatter. "That's step one," Vivian said, brushing her hands together. "Now, we deal with Marcus." Evelyn's heart pounded, fear and exhilaration warring within her. "What are you doing, Mom? He'll be furious." "Let him be," Vivian said, her voice steel. "He's forgotten who you are." "Evelyn. It's time to remind him." Vivian's plan unfolded with the precision of a military campaign. She called in favors, old contacts from her real estate days who knew the underbelly of the fashion world. Marcus's empire was built on deals, but deals could be undone. Vivian's network was vast, her influence subtle but devastating. She began by leaking whispers to the press, nothing overt, just enough to plant seeds of doubt about Marcus's leadership. A missed deadline here, a questionable expense there. Beluto's stock dipped, investors murmured, and Marcus, distracted by Isabella's allure, didn't notice the noose tightening. Evelyn, meanwhile, was pulled back into her mother's orbit, her spine stiffening under Vivian's relentless encouragement. "You're not just his wife," Vivian said one evening, pouring them both a glass of wine. "Evelyn's untouched, her pregnancy a constant reminder of what was at stake. You're the heart of Beluto. Those designs, that vision, it's yours. He's just the face." Evelyn began to see it, the truth she'd buried under months of betrayal. She dug out her old sketchbooks, her fingers tracing the lines of dresses she'd abandoned when Marcus's attention wandered. She started designing again, late at night when the penthouse was quiet, her pencil moving with a fury she hadn't felt in years. Vivian watched, nodding approvingly, but her focus was on the bigger picture. She hired a private investigator to dig into Isabella's past, uncovering a trail of discarded lovers and shady deals. The mistress wasn't just a threat to Evelyn's marriage, she was a liability to Beluto. The gala was the turning point. Marcus had planned it as a showcase for Beluto's new collection, with Isabella as the star, wearing the scarlet dress that now lay in pieces. Evelyn, bolstered by Vivian's resolve, arrived uninvited, her own design, a sleek, midnight blue gown that hugged her pregnant figure, turning heads as she entered. Marcus's face paled when he saw her, but Isabella's smile was smug, unaware of the storm coming. Vivian had ensured the press was there, cameras flashing as Evelyn took the stage, her voice steady as she unveiled her new collection, one Marcus hadn't seen. The designs were bold, innovative, a return to the Beluto that had once captivated the world. The crowd erupted, and Marcus's empire began to crumble. Investors pulled out, citing mismanagement. Isabella's past was leaked, her credibility shredded. Evelyn, with Vivian's backing, launched her own label, taking Beluto's best designers with her. Marcus begged, his charm replaced by desperation, but Evelyn was done. She walked away, her mother at her side, the city's lights reflecting the fire in her eyes. The fashion world would remember her, not as the wife who ironed, but as the woman who rebuilt herself from the ashes of betrayal.